let's move on to final thoughts. Obviously, Tom, we've spent 4 hours with the Nintendo Switch 2. I'm curious where you think this lands. I'll tell you where I am with it. First of all, in terms of the success of the system, I think we're in safe hands here. I'm just going to say it again. Mario Kart World really is just a system seller. It's a game I want to play. It just perfect execution based on what I saw. Brilliant as handheld. Looks great on a 4K screen. And what can I say? I'm hugely excited to playing it. And the Nintendo stuff again, games built for that specific hardware, you can just achieve magic, and especially when you're sort of scaling up stuff from Switch 1. I mean, the Metroid Prime demo was great. I mean, it's a game that I want to play, right? Donkey Kong, I can't say I'm hugely enthusiastic about it, but I think it's going to find a following. I mean, literally, I've played only 10 minutes of it or so, but it didn't quite grab me in the same way as the other games. But I think it's going to find an audience, and I think it's really nice to see Nintendo doing new things with their new system. I think that's really, really nice. Obviously, though, when we move on to the third-party side of things, it's a different situation, right? We've got developers that may be new to the system, that haven't had as much exposure to the hardware as Nintendo's own, and they're having to port across sister games which were designed for other systems effectively. I think the thing that I'd like to get across is what is the number one thing that kind of frustrated me with the original Switch? And it is the fact that I used it only as a handheld system because the docked presentation in most games just wasn't really good enough. It looked poor, even though we're still running at the 1080p style presentations. It works fine on a big screen. Not spectacular, but based on typical viewing distances, everything I saw looked fine. And yeah, so ultimately that's basically where things have kind of landed, exactly in line with expectations, pretty much in line with what we expected from the system. I am hoping to see more of Cyberpunk and to see improvements there, because there were frame rate issues that were particularly profound in some of the areas where we kind of expect. It's too early to have like an outline of system capabilities on Switch 2. But looking at Cyberpunk, it's really easy to test the stuff where you would expect to find system limits. Traversal. I mean, even on Xbox Series X, S, and PS5, the 60 FPS performance modes can drop frames when you're doing traversal. Switch 2 does it at 30. I was just actually looking at some of our old Cyberpunk footage, Tom, specifically your last gen coverage.
Oh yeah,
and it's like you've got a battery of tests that just shows stuff like CPU limits. Having a big fight in the open world with a whole bunch of entities causes frame rate drops, and it's exactly here. And yeah, I was really surprised to see that they were targeting the Phantom Liberty content for the demo. I guess it is, some of the most graphically intensive and impressive areas of Cyberpunk 2077 as a whole. But right now, it really does cause some significant performance drops there. But I did have a quick look at the earlier content from the beginning of the first game. It seemed to hold up a bit better. Similarly with indoor stuff, like when you're on a mission, for example, that's within a contained area, that seemed to run a whole lot better. A lot of work to do there, though, I suspect. But I'm really interested to see where it ends up. So yeah, I mean, Switch 2, I think it's in a really good place. The hardware is excellent. The first party stuff is looking really, really promising to absolutely amazing. I'm keeping my pre-orders open. Let's just say that for sure. Third-party stuff, I think that's going to be evolving along the way as people get more au fait with the system, similar to what we saw in the past, right? I think, the concept of the impossible port hasn't gone away, but I think there's going to be some sort of hard set limitations on certain current-gen games that may not make the transition. But I do think we're going to be seeing a lot of last-gen ports and a lot of cross-gen games because it just kind of makes sense. Not sure we'll see Dragon's Dogma, though, there, Tom. That one is so CPU-heavy. I'm kind of curious if the Switch 2 can actually handle that. But certainly, stuff like Resident Evil, I'd expect to see.
Yeah.
It all sort of makes sense from that perspective. I'm curious where you land on this, Tom, because, I mean, from my perspective, it is indeed Switch 2. It is a sequel, same strengths and weaknesses, but moved on a generation. And Curious where you
It's
land on this.
yeah, 100%. It is a much needed iteration hardware wise, rather than a massive innovation, which is, being something we've expected from Nintendo with every generation, some sort of quirk or novelty, and we anticipated something from Switch 2, and we got that in a small amount with the mouse controls. Um, Honestly, going into this, and I'm sure many people going into this demo exhibition had the same idea, is what we're about to see going to justify my pre-order, the money I put down ahead of time? And for me, I 100% agree. It is Mario Kart World. Like, that is the game which stands above all the rest that I saw in terms of quality, in terms of the utilization of Switch 2, in terms of the visual quality of it. As secondary to that, I think there's games like Street Fighter 6, which I would say, is a game that I would genuinely play on the go as a portable experience. I'm excited to take that away, and I find some value out of that. And the Cyberpunk side as well is obviously less polished in the build we saw. It's 7 weeks old, and there is time to polish it more by the time it releases. But based on what we're seeing, I was still really happy to see it there, and I thought it was a very audacious thing to have that.
Yeah,
On
absolutely. The
display.
ambition there. I mean, first of all, kudos to CD Projekt Red for trying it, for putting the
Yeah,
effort in.
100%.
Secondly, for showing it. Thirdly, for actually showing us really ambitious content within the game.
Yeah.
And I mean, basically, it sort of sets an expectation level. I do think it has been one of the most contentiously received demos, though, and I think they could have played it a little more safe in terms of just the PR side of things. But the ambition, holy crap, I thought it was really, really impressive.
Yeah, and CDPR loved to do this. Like, remember Witcher 3 on Switch? I love an impossible port, and CDPR always loved to rise to that challenge. But I actually have a lot of faith in this one, that it'll turn out to be quite a decent experience. I think I might live to eat those words, but I'm really excited to see how that turns out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing I'd like to add is the concept of the Switch 2 edition. Going into the sort of Switch 2 period, my concern was that the first party output could actually be significantly lower than it was before, specifically because they've kind of run out of games from prior platforms to bring to the Switch. And then, now we've got the Switch 2 editions. And, obviously, I don't think they're just going to be sitting still with these games. I mean, I'm just thinking about stuff like Super Mario Wonder, coming to Switch 2 with enhancements. I think that could be, really compelling for people to actually go back to the games that are in their library and play them with a fresh lick of paint and performance upgrades. I think that would be absolutely fantastic. But you weren't hands-on, Oliver, but I'm sure you've got a lot of thoughts on where things are sitting now with Switch 2.
No, I was not hands-on, unfortunately. But yeah, I think like the 10,000-foot view on this, the whole thing, at least to me, is that this was a showcase that was very heavy on last-gen software and cross-gen software. In here, I think in a lot of games where we see a Switch 2 version and a comparable last-gen console version, that it's kind of coming in at about that level, about that PS4 level, in that kind of range there, in terms of that last-gen software, which is not surprising to me, although it's become more controversial over the past 2 weeks, but it's not surprising to me because that's what the simulations that Rich did told us roughly pre-reveal. That's what the hardware spec generally indicates. It's also in the ballpark of what you might think, given that the Switch 2 is using an 8nm process and it's using an older graphics architecture and things like this. So that's what things have been generally indicating. And in this showcase, that's also what the games have been indicating, like in Yakuza 0, which we did not talk about thus far, but we did test. It was developed as a cross-gen game for PS3 and PS4 systems, and on PS4 it ran at 1080p 60. On Switch 2 it also appears to run at 1080p 60, so we are kind of split on whether the asset from Sega was the correct asset or the asset from Nintendo was the correct asset in terms of its presentation. It does look like that asset from Nintendo is more reflective of the actual experience on Switch 2 hardware and was probably the representative asset for Switch 2 hardware there, which again is no surprise. that's fine for cross-gen games. I think, to me, the key question that still remains about the Switch 2, and there aren't very many questions that remain because we know so much about the hardware, but the one key question that still remains is how do current gen games run in the system? Like, we've not seen a whole lot of that. We've seen Split Fiction, a couple of games, but no real demanding current gen games. I think the game that is probably going to come into focus there is the title like Star Wars Outlaws. And in that respect, you can see a few things on Switch 2 that are maybe favorable, like the RAM allotment, like the storage, which is probably quite good, the decompression hardware. But on the GPU side and the CPU side, is it going to fare that well? Again, that remains to be seen. I hope that it will, but I suspect we're going to be seeing a lot of ports that are substantially downgraded on Switch 2 to a level where you'd probably prefer to play them on a home console system. But, I hope that we do see a good result there in some of those more demanding titles. On the first-party side, though, I think there are a lot more positive signs. Mario Kart looks great. I think the Switch 2 editions look great. I think everything they've shown off looks pretty good. But of course, with Nintendo, they're building games up from the ground up for that system, so I always expected they'd do a good job. But here I'm kind of interested this generation to see if we see, like, Nintendo titles that are embracing PBR materials, that are embracing TAA, that are embracing great GI, possibly DLSS, more sophisticated rendering features here. That's something that we're not seeing a great deal of so far. Again, very early days. But I could also see Nintendo going the route of saying, okay, we're going to emphasize higher resolutions, we're going to emphasize higher frame rates, we're going to kind of max out on our display support there, and we're not going to lean into too much into these really sophisticated rendering kind of pitfalls that have led developers to invest hundreds of millions of dollars into single titles. I could also see that being the case, or a mix of both approaches. But yeah, ultimately, I think we know a lot about the system. This only kind of confirms some of our suspicions about the system for the most part. There's still a few holes, though, in the system's library. Like, I'm really curious to see what Nintendo does outside of that launch window period, and outside of the Switch 2 edition titles. And I'm really curious to see what third parties do with really demanding software.
Absolutely, yeah. There's still a lot of question marks here. We'll start to get some answers once the system's out, obviously, and then the third-party rollout begins. I think on a sort of macro level, though, what sets Switch apart from prior Nintendo platforms, and ultimately it was that there was a huge amount of third-party support. And that was instrumental in that system being so successful. The games don't need to look like the PlayStation 5 versions ultimately, because you're dealing with an entirely different proposition of hardware, really. And it's a proposition that not only worked, but produced, an exceptionally successful generation for Nintendo. So, the focus on the power narrative I'm finding kind of interesting, but ultimately it didn't really matter. And in actual fact, we've actually done a couple of videos, Oliver, based on first and third party games, which were running on the original Switch, where, obviously you hear the news at launch, pre-launch, that it's running a Tegra X1. That's not a particularly great processor. Oh, it's running a downclocked Switch 1. Sorry, a downclocked Tegra X1. That's not particularly great news. And yet it's not as if we had any kind of problems with the quality of software across that generation. There were some absolutely incredible games. And we actually did videos on first and third party. And I think, the bandwagon is just going to continue to roll into Switch 2. So, the power narrative is almost kind of, less relevant almost when you're dealing with a Switch style device. I mean, that's just basic, right? What can I say? Obviously, anything and everything Switch 2 that we can get our hands on at launch or pre-launch, we'll be there. I'd say overall, I came out of the presentation highly optimistic and obviously wanting one, which I think is the key metric there. So, yes, looking forward to seeing more.